Welcome, everyone. I'm Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the African Studies Center, and it's a wonderful pleasure to welcome all of you here today, and especially to welcome back our very distinguished alumnus, Associate Professor Assan Sarr, recently promoted, I believe, so very big congratulations to you. Did his PhD here in African history in 2010, and now at Ohio University. He's a researcher on topics of peace and conflict, especially issues related to land, environment, agriculture, oral history, and Islam, which is going to be a focus of his talk today. He's written a book called Islam, Power, and Dependency in the Gambia River Basin, and he's published numerous articles and book chapters in prestigious journals and in distinguished book series. He's on the press board of Ohio University Press, a core member of the African Studies program at Ohio University. Great to know that. And he's been honored as a teacher. He got a teaching award. And we certainly benefit here from his wonderful teaching in that several of his students have come here to do PhDs in African history. Some of them are with us right here in the room. So we're very, very fortunate to be on the receiving end of your teaching expertise. He's also received, he's received more than one teaching award at Ohio University. So you're warmly welcome. We're delighted to have you here talking about your new project on the Muslim clerics of Gambia.
Thank you very much, Professor Monson, for that generous and kind introduction. I am very, very happy to be back in East Lansing, which is one of my homes in the United States, and very happy to see old faces as well as new faces. And thank you to the African Studies Center for inviting me here. It's always a great pleasure. The talk that I'm giving today is part of a larger book project that I'm working on right now. And, you know, it is still in its infancy, but I'm hoping to share a couple of ideas that I hope will stimulate a great deal of discussion. In the 1980s, Madina Cherno, which is commonly known as Cherno, was still a very small village of approximately 60 to 70 households that lived in this village, and the population of the village never amounted to more than 2,000 people. The village was relatively isolated as there were no satisfactory road networks linking it to the outside world. The decision to live in this remote community appears to be intentional. At least that's what some of my informants told me when I did interviews there with the help of Abdullah. We've traveled together on one of my trips there. And but a lot of archival sources seems to suggest that this is just a place that is significantly underdeveloped, and it has been like that since the colonial period. Like colonial records just indicate the poor economic state of this part of the Gambia. And it is on the northern bank of the Gambia River. Those of you who are familiar with the Gambia know that the River Gambia runs through the center of the country all the way through the end, bifurcating the land into two halves. So this half is the northern bank of the Gambia, and this half is the lower bank of the Gambia River. And if you look, Madina Cherno should be somewhere here. Sorry, it's a bit blurry. Yes, it's up there. And this map gives you a sense of where we're talking about. So it's a village that is not easily accessible because there are no paved roads that connect it to the outside world. Also, it's not sitting right on the banks of on the banks of the river, so river navigation is not an option as well. Now, people in this community told me that the cleric who founded this village consciously decided to relocate to this difficult or hard-to-reach place, simply because he did not want to live in a place where his life and his lifestyle will be corrupted by city life. Secondly, he wanted to be in a place where he could worship Allah and farm, because farming was a central part of the kind of life that he wanted to live. He said farming was the most honorable kind of job that any Muslim should try to do. He did not also want to get involved in larger political issues or decision making, or have any interaction with the power holders or the politicians in a way. And I should say that this is where I was born in the in this village, and this is where I also spent 9 years of my teenage life studying the Quran as a young Muslim boy. And I remember even in the 80s, politicians would not come into the village to campaign during elections because the Marabu, or the Muslim cleric who was alive at the time, I will talk about him a little bit, did not want politicians to go there and campaign. And this was at the time when Gambia was one of the countries that was known for its electoral democratic traditions and so on. So maintaining his political neutrality and keeping off politicians was one of his objectives that he had. The relative isolation of the village, however, did not prevent its citizens from traveling to distant places, such as Futa Toro, Mauritania, Sudan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, to seek education or spread the Tijaniya Tariqa, which is the predominant Islamic movement, or brotherhood, as we call it, in this region. So many young men from this village would aspire to travel to these places to seek more education in Middle Eastern countries. And many also have done the Hajj, particularly in the 1950s. I think around 1956 there was a flight that started operating between the Gambia and mainly London, but they were able to, some Gambian Muslims were able to travel that way to perform the Hajj. Otherwise, there are countless stories of how people will walk from place over many years to get to Saudi Arabia so that they can perform the Hajj. That's also a story that I want to discuss here in this talk. That this village, which is seemingly isolated, and to this day it's still a hard-to-reach place, was still intricately connected to the wider Islamic world. Also, this isolation did not prevent visitors from traveling to the village, even during the rainy seasons when the road conditions were especially very bad. Men and women traveled to the village for weekly Juma prayers on Fridays, wherein they could get blessings from the cleric who prayed for them. And these were mostly government civil servants or aspiring young men who wanted, aspiring travelers who are mostly young men who wanted to travel to European destinations or elsewhere in sight for greener pastures. They would go and seek prayers. People who are looking for jobs, people who have family members that are sick. Healing was a very important service that these clerics offered. And most of these people, when they're going to the community, to this community, they would take with them various items like collar knots, textiles, candles, or even cash, which they will give as what we call hadiya or the sadaqah, as a gift to the Marabu and his followers, who can then in return pray for them. Like most of the Senegambian residents, members of this village identified as Tijaniya. The Tijaniya order takes its name from its founder, Sheikh Ahmad al-Tijan, a cleric of southern Algerian origin who gathered a large following in his adopted city of Fez in Morocco, with teachings which he claimed were revealed to him directly by God, Allah, and Prophet Muhammad. This is one of the most predominant Muslim tariqa in the region. Maybe the next most common, most popular one would be the Murid Brotherhood. But the Fuller, for the most part, identify as Tijaniya, and this is significant. This story, in particular, helps me to think about key historiographical questions about Islam and the Senegambian region. First, Senegambian historiography neglects small and isolated centers outside of Touba, Tivaouane, and Kaolack. We know a lot more about these places as centers for Islamic scholarship. Most of those Muslim families, clerical families, were very outward looking. They aspired to attract a lot of followers, but rarely do we pay enough attention to those marabouts or clerics who opted for the opposite of that, who said, well, I want to be in an isolated place. I don't want to grow my village into a massive urban settlement. I want to be small so that I can continue to worship Allah in the way that I want to be, because big can be corrupted, small is better. And much of the scholarship, I think, when you look at the literature on Islam in the Senegambia region, you might come out of reading that thinking that, oh, the most important places that help to spread Islam or Islamization itself were these major Islamic centers where all these well-known clerics or jihadists like Alhagie Omar Jallow or people like Maba Jaxu Ba, Fodé Silla, Ahmadou Bamba Mbacké, Alhaji Abdoulaye Niass, or Alhaji Malik Sy. These were the people who basically spread Islam to the urban as well as small villages. And in many ways that is true. But I want to argue that people like Cherno Omar Jallow and his son, Alhagie Baba Jallow, also help extend Islam to areas where previously we did not have a very strong footing. Islam did not have a very strong footing in those areas. For instance, in the parts of southern Senegal to the east that we call the Kabada area, which historically wasn't really a very heavily Islamized region, and also western Casamance, where the Jolas also lived. It was these petty marabouts, I call them, for lack of a better word, that actually did the job there. And what is also significant is that the historiography of the region is overwhelmingly centered on northern Senegambia. Not much attention is being given on the southern section of the region. And that puts emphasis on the Senegalo-Mauritania zone, where we study much of the Fouta Toro and Saint Louis, which the Wolof call Ndar, and some of the popular destinations in Mauritania where young men would go often to seek education. And I should say that my uncle, my father's younger brother, who passed away just a few years ago, was one such individual who went to Fouta Toro to study Saint Louis and ended up in Mauritania. And when he went back to this village, then the Marabout asked him to relocate to a Jola village, where he founded a mosque and started converting some of the Jola into Islam well into the 20th century. So that part of the story, I think it's also very important to bring out. I also would acknowledge that the scholarship is no doubt rich, that we've had a lot of good studies on women in the Sufi movements that has been done. We've really have very good studies on the 19th century Islamic revolutions. Many studies today are looking at the growth of transnational Islamic movements in the area, whether it's the Jama al-Talib or some of the Muridia, who are also expanding into New York City and other places around the world, but also the Shia, who are Professor Mara Lightman's work on the Shia in Senegal is really, I think, one notable example of this. But in all of these discussions of Sufi, of transnational Islamic movements or groups, one thing that seemed to also come out in this literature is that many young African Muslims who are returning from Arabian institutions or Middle Eastern institutions, when they come back to their homelands, they tend to be very critical of the Sufi brotherhoods, and so they are often trying to move Islam into the more orthodox Sunni Wahhabi kinds of orientation. That is one thing that you can get from the scholarship. I can give a few examples of studies that actually highlight that. But studying Medina Cherno invites me to really question that formulation, because most of the people they have who are coming from Misra, Al-Azhar, or in various Middle Eastern destinations, they are not abandoning their Tijaniya roots. And so they're not critical of this Sufi order at all. Why is that? Even though they've studied Islamic law and theology and fiqh and other things, but they are not critical of the Senegambian Sufi style order. Why? My sense is that many of them return from either Egypt or Morocco or elsewhere, and then took over the Quranic schools from their fathers or uncles, or and then continue to chant praises of Sheikh Tijan, and as well as their grandfathers and great-grandfathers who are all Tijans. So for me, this really represents, I think, an important deviation from what I think much of the studies seem to suggest, that yes, you have indeed a very sizable group of young Muslim Africans who are returning from the Middle East and preaching one kind of Islamic orientation, but you also have a sizable number of them who are not, and who are just going back into what their parents are. I think here the importance of family traditions and continuing family traditions, and for me, I think these are often people who stand to benefit from the continuation of this tariqa as a whole. But if you are from a family that really did not have any religious authority, and you went over to the Middle East to study, and then you come back, in order for you to find a voice, you might have to deviate from what is already in existence so as to attract a following. Now, I know that might be a very reductive kind of claim, but I think that that's something that I really want to look at some more. Related to this is also the tendency to look at 20th century now migrations as something really connecting these previously European colonies to Western capitals and destinations. Rarely do we pay attention to the North African, Sub-Saharan African, well, I don't like that phrase, but Senegambian, North African, Middle Eastern connections. And I really, like, if you take the historiography of Northern Africa and West Africa, there is very limited dialogue there. So I wanted to actually venture into this topic to sort of consider that kind of connection. And this family, before I get to the specifics here with regards to the two clerics that I looked at, these two families are of Fuller heritage. And unlike the Fullers of Futa Toro, these are Fullers from Futa Jallow, from Guinea-Conakry. And they came from a region called Labe. The person who actually moved out of Labe, his name was Cherno Ibrahim Jallow. He was said to have moved to Mauritania to study. And then from there, his son, Cherno Jallow, then moved to Saint Louis and Futa Toro. He was said to have lived in Saint Louis for 12 years. That's not surprising if you read the work of David Robinson. Saint Louis plays a very important role in the history of Islam in the Senegambia. That's where many young men actually met with people like Sheikh Sidia Baba of Mauritania. Ahmadou Bamba was said to have lived there. People, Sheikh Saad Bou of Mauritania, when he moved from Mauritania to Senegal, he lived in Saint Louis. It's a very, very important place, and many Islamic centers and scholarship, and so it's not surprising that Cherno Jallow would relocate to that place. And by the way, let me say that the French had also established a school of translation that translated work from Arabic to French and vice versa. And it was these clerics that converged in this important place that made St. Louis really an important regional hub. Another one was Pir and Koki, and these were all important Islamic centers where young men who grew up in places like this could go to those places to further their education and so on before even moving to Sudan or Egypt or the Middle East. So it's a very important place. Alhagie Umar Tal was said to have also lived in St. Louis. Well, he visited St. Louis and met with people like that. So it was Cherno Jallow's son, Cherno Omar Jallow, that interests me, and his son, Cherno Baba Jallow. Cherno Omar was the one that left his father in St. Louis and moved to the region that we call Salum, closer to the banks of the Gambia River. He was a contemporary of people like Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, Sheikh Abdoulaye Niass, and Cherno Aliou Dem of Sokone. And he was also a contemporary of Maba Jahuba. There are stories of how he encountered Maba Jahuba, who waged the jihad in the mid-19th century. So he was also a contemporary of another Toranka in the Gambia we call the Fullers from Futa Toro, who are called the Torobe. We call them the Toranka. That's a Mandinkanized version of the name. And even though these people, their roots are not from Futa Toro, they're from Futa Jalon, they are called Torankas. He met another Toranka called Cherno Serigne Mas Ka, who established a village called Medina Serigne Mas. The current Imam Ratib of the Gambia is actually a son of this family. So a very important clerical family. To cut a very long story short, it is Cherno Omar Jallow who decided to move from St. Louis and Futa Toro to the areas very close to the banks of the Gambia River. And once he settled in the banks of the Gambia River, he met with Cherno Ali Dem, who actually gave him a wife. So his wife was also from a clerical family. What is important here is that he had a son called Cherno Baba, who was born somewhere around 1890. And with the two of them, they established the village of Madina Cherno. They call it Madina from the name, the Saudi Arabian city of Medina. And Cherno in Halpular in Fula means the Marabout, the cleric. So this is the village of the Marabout. And once he settled this place, he called it Madina Cherno. And this place is, the choice that he made in choosing this place is really significant for the kinds of narratives that his descendants would give. One is that it was that part of the Gambia that the inhabitants of the area who already had settled there did not want to settle because they believed that there were evil spirits, including jinns, that lived in those places. So the decision to establish in those, to settle in that place is really very calculated. Because I have, in my previous work, quoted a traveling commissioner, Emilius Hopkinson, who wrote that the Mandinka, quote and unquote, do not want to live in this place because they believe that those evil spirits will ruin the lives of people who try to trespass on their land. So those lands were not actually empty, they were homes of supernatural beings, and humans should not either try to cultivate those lands or live in those domains. So how did why did Cherno Omar and his son then decide to move into those places? I argue that being able to deploy or claim that you possess supernatural powers and can perform miracles is an important way of attracting what I call religious authority. It's a kind of authority that helps you attract followers. And it's a way that people can actually, you can augment your image and your reputation among your followers by making such claims. So, you know, we've had countless claims by Muslim clerics who would say that Prophet Muhammad appeared to them, either in dream or through visions that they communicated with really prominent figures in the history of Islam. Why are those stories significant? It's significant because here is what is cool about the claims that Cherno Omar's and Cherno Baba's followers are given, that when he decided to move into the area, he was able to establish some connections with some of the jinns and talk to them. He was able to convince some of the jinns to convert into Islam, so that Islamization did not just affect human beings, it also affected spirits. So jinns then could become kafirs or Muslims, and the kafir one is really a very mean one, and the Muslim one is the good one that always supported and provided for people, or healed people, or gave them some unique opportunities that other people ordinarily would not get. That's number one. Number two, the spirit of the dragon, the Ninkinanka, it's very important. And this is what I like about this story. When Cherno Omar moved into the area, he tried to persuade the Ninkinanka, the dragon, to leave the river or the swamp that connected the area to, it's a small stream that ran for several kilometers and empties into the river Gambia. So he tried to persuade the Ninkinanka, this gigantic serpent, to leave the area, because people believe that when, and this is in the colonial records, by the way, the local people believe that if you see a Ninkinanka, your life is ruined. You're either dead, or for the rest of your life you're going to be paralyzed, or something really terrible is going to happen to you. So so people could not venture into those places to either farm or settle in those places. So he tried to persuade the Ninkinanka to leave, and when that didn't work, he decided to fight the Ninkinanka. So warfare is another thing. Warfare is not just a military reality, it's also a spiritual reality. And for me, again, it comes back to the salient question of to what end? Why these stories? And people believe them. It's not necessarily something that we as historians can actually stand and put a stamp on it to authenticate the validity of the story. But the mere fact that so many people believed it would actually shape the way in which they experience their religious or spiritual this thing. So he was able to drive the Ninkinanka out, and then he was beating up Jeans that were crying for their lives, and they fled the area. And of course, the ordinary people could not see the Jeans. They could only hear them crying out loud, but they can't see them. So then he settled in this place where, if you look at this area, you know, I talked about this in my book, Islam, Power and Dependency in the Gambia River. This is where mostly all the powerful and the biggest communities actually lived in the Gambia. The Mandinka, who are mainly rice-growing people who need access to the river and the fertile floodplains where they could cultivate rice. And this is in the upland areas. That's where you often would find Fula and Wolof communities settled there. So why is that? So you can see settlement patterns taking different shape. And who are these people who are settling in the upland areas? They're mostly these people who claim to be clerics, who have the power to drive away the spirits and therefore convert these locations into important Islamic centers. Now, of course, these settlements, therefore, this pattern or this development, which started in the mid-19th century, had major implications for the environment too, because as many of these villages were appearing, the forest was disappearing. Because people were, this is where most of the intensive farming, peanut farming, would take place. And much of the peanuts that are being produced is meant for the outside market to European destinations for export. So I talked about that. But what is crucial about this story is that as soon as Cherno Omar settled in Medina Cherno, and he started now attracting students. He then had a very wide following. In fact, two of Maba Jahu Ba's grandsons, who were Said Mati Ba's sons, studied with him. So he was a very prominent individual. So he attracted students from Walo, from Salum. These are all small 19th century states in the Senegambia. And he also got some students from Guinea-Bissau, who were mostly Fulas from Guinea-Bissau. He got some students from the Kabada region of the Casamance area, and transformed this small community into what I call a very diverse, multicultural place. At one point in the history of this village, there were at least hundreds of students who spoke Serer, which is my language, or Mandinka, or Wolof, or Jola, in this small place, where they were there purposely to be educated as Muslims. So in this place, farming was a very important activity. Unfortunately, for Cherno Omar, he died in 1940. And so by this time, then his son, Cherno Baba Jallow, took over. This guy was born around 1890. This is what and in some ways, you know, the colonial records are making references to this village, at least by the early 1900s. And he's mentioned there. So this is why, you know, I don't know the precise date when he was born, but I think it's reasonable to think that he was born at least 10 years before the record started mentioning him. Anyhow, he took over from his father in 1910, and this is what one of the colonial commissioners for the North Bank said about Cherno Baba and his father, Cherno Omar, in 1933. He said, I've been playing with this quote for a very long time, so if I don't see it, I will. Okay, here is what he said. Madina Cherno was one of the few villages with schools at which advanced Arabic is taught. And the other villages are Farafenye, where Sirif Malain, a native of French Sudan, who claimed to be a sheriff, like someone who traces his ancestry back to Prophet Muhammad, who has very special stature and standing in many of these Muslim communities. He was settled there, and he was from French Sudan or Mali. And the village of Medina Serigne, which I also mentioned, was quoted in this text, where Serigne Maska and his son Momodu Ka were actively teaching students and their disciples the Quran. Then Arafang Biraima Dabo and Arafang Kemo Jame, who were all Mandinkas, were also listed in this commissioner's report. And they were based in Sitanunku and Essel, which was one of the royal villages in royal towns in the Gambia. And Major McLean went further to praise the profound knowledge that these clerics had. He said, some of these teachers are really highly educated. I know one who is now dead, who evolved a calendar whereby he could convert the days of the moon into days of the month, and even overcame the difficulty of the Libya. So, and they were visited, I mean, in 1934, these clerics were visited by a man called Abdullahi ul Sheikh al-Sidia from Mauritania, who visited the Gambia and went through some of these villages. Alhaji Abdullah Nyas also visited these places where, all of them, they would go pay their respects to these clerics and seek prayers for them. They would pray for them, but also they would be prayed for by some of these clerics. So this is how Medina Cherno standing, at least from the early 19th century, early 20th century, became known and reputed as an important Islamic center, where I would say any young boy or a girl you meet, they often would have memorized the entire Quran. That's the tradition. Now, though, it's changing. But people of my age and below, they all have to memorize the Quran before you move on to pursue any kind of education that you do. So very important. And one thing that this man did, though, he took over from where his father left and did some significant improvements in the Tijaniya order, things that his own father could not do. So, for example, the number of daras, Quranic schools, increased substantially under his leadership, from 4 major daras to 11 in total. And he started getting students even from faraway distances, more than his father was able to do. Then he built, this is him. I will show you, Ablai would not remember this, but all the Gambian cars in 1980, maybe they probably did not amount to 10 cars, but he was wealthy, and he had his own car. This is the mosque. I will show you an image of the mosque. He was able to build this mosque, and this car that you see here was more or less the ambulance of this village that would take people from the village, if they are sick, to the regional health center. He was also able to convince the district commissioner for this, still under colonial rule, to build the clinic that is there in the village, which was one of the only clinics in that area up until recently. So then he also allowed the government to build the primary school, of which I'm a product of that school, in the village. And you know, over the years, though, the impact of that development is really noticeable, because now these daras, the Quranic schools, have really begun to lose their standing in this village. So very few people are leaving their children to be in these daras for very long. So most of the young ones are going through the secular English-style schools. But this is him right there, and he also started, maybe aided by the revolution in communication technologies, and in the 1970s he started an annual Gammo, which is the Maulud Nabi, the honoring and celebrating the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. So he made it an annual event and extended his influence to Batos, which is now Banjul, the Gambian capital, and the surrounding urban areas. And then he started reaching out to people in Dakar and so on. So he would also get, he would invite a sheriff from Mauritania also, who would grace the occasion. So it really like brought the village even more, it made the village more outward looking. Then one of the things that he also did that I wanted to talk about was that he funded many of the young men from the village to go to Sudan or Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And many of them returned back, but he still held on to the idea that also living in this remote area is very significant, is very important. So for example, one of his sons who passed away a couple of years ago had a doctorate in Islamic law from Al-Azhar and in Egypt. And when he returned back, he was appointed by the Gambian government to be Gambia's ambassador to Libya. And this man said, no, he has to be here. He will be responsible for my Quranic school and farm. But he's not going, he's not going to work as an ambassador. Now, I should say that in general, though, the clerics themselves didn't do the hard work of farming itself. So they would delegate. Well, I would say that that's true for most of the elders in the Gambia. Once you have children who grew up to take over, they take over. In any case, the importance of staying politically neutral was significant. And what is really instrumental about this story is that this mosque was funded primarily from his own funds and his followers, and people volunteered to actually provide the sand and the gravel and all the materials that created this unique architecture. He also, in addition to doing all that, he opened up a piece of land that his father did not open up by driving away some additional genes from that area. So this forest is called Bangali, and that's part of a very important story that people share in the Gambia. And he established, and this is fascinating, he established a massive orchard with cashew nut trees, mangoes, oranges, pine, all kinds of bananas, all kinds of fruits that some of the nurseries or the seeds, people claim were purchased in Sierra Leone. He sent one of his students to Sierra Leone to purchase this and created a very big orchard. And this is the important story. He said, people, and he did this during the 1970s when the Senegambia region, I mean, I'm sure David and others who studied this place can confirm this. In the 1970s, there was a very bad drought and famine in the area, so food was a major issue, and he was feeding a lot of people. To this day, people can harvest freely anything they want from the orchard, but he said he will not forgive anyone who sells any product of this orchard for profit. So it was just meant for supporting and helping people. And so he had a lot of farmlands and a lot of livestock, which he said was there for the service of the community that he needed to provide for the people. And for me, I think this is really very significant, because when I look at some studies on religion in West Africa, a noted example is a book that is really well done by J.D.Y. Peel, Religious Encounter and the Making of the Yoruba. You know, that section that talks about gift giving and receiving, it's so very materialistic, in which he says that when people give, they expect the recipients of their gifts to be dependent on them. So that there is a material calculation involved in the act of giving and receiving. But what I seem to be gleaning from this case is that there is another explanation for why people give. If you give, there is salvation. If you believe that in the hereafter, that you will be rewarded by God for supporting the poor and helping them. So to the point where you don't want to be even seen as the one giving, so maybe you will just give this stuff to a young person and say, don't, when he asked you or she asked you, who gave you this, don't mention my name, but give this to the people so that they can pray for me, so that I can get the reward hereafter when I die and hopefully go into paradise. So this is, I know, very preliminary, but this is what I'm thinking about in my work on Islam and this clerical family. Let me show you a few slides. This is one of the schools, the madrasa. All the undergraduate students here, MSU is really nice. This is quite, you know, I spent 9 years of my life doing this. So there are a number of daras like this where young kids will congregate at night and study and read, and they will. The light is often provided by the wood. This is the mosque that he built, and those buildings right here, that's the primary school. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarr, for sharing your new project with us. There's so much to think about. Yeah. Now we have time for questions, for sharing, for conversation. And just to remind everyone, we do pass the microphone. It doesn't amplify your voice. It just makes sure that your voice is on the live stream so everybody can listen in. So I think, Shingi, will you be passing? Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions at a time if that comes up, so that we can let everybody have a chance to talk.
Hi, Assan. Thank you for a really lovely talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask the most simple one here. So it seems like the Cherno Jallows, they coexisted pretty well with both the colonial and post-colonial governments. You know, they brought a primary school and a health facility. This is, I think, opposite from the story that we usually hear about like important clerics who are rejecting these like westernizing influences. So first, why do you think that was? And the second question is, were there any ways that he tried to, you know, restrict his followers in any particular ways? I know sometimes, you know, certain Chernos will forbid certain activity in their area, or they'll try to keep people farming certain things to prevent their integration with the secular world. But it doesn't sound like that's necessarily the case here.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. Well, I will start with the two questions, one related with the critical mind of the people who went to the Orient, studied and came back. One of the arguments people generally sometimes put forward is that is the lack of reference. For example, the people, the clerics sometimes have, when they are asked, for example, to justify a practice or justify something. So that lack of a reference from the book or from the Sunnah is one of the arguments from those people who criticize. I know there are so many, as those you also mentioned, which are very, yes, yeah. And the other question is related to the Medina Cherno and the other Medinas that are around. I know that some of the people would just go and then create a new Medina because they want to replicate. But I know that, for example, with Alhagie Malik in the north and with Ahmadu Bamba, and what happened was the graduate students would be sent to go, for example, to remote places and create, for example, a new school, a new dara, a new Medina. And that was even why, for example, I think Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, when he created Touba, he wanted to go away from civilization, quote unquote. So he established Touba, but then Touba grew up to become what it is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One more question?
One more, yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, Assan, thank you for your talk. It made me very happy for a number of reasons. It's great to see you back. I appreciated your critique of Peel toward the end and his materialist orientation. But at the same time, I thought that possibly your talk was somewhat in the same lines, along sort of a materialist orientation, which I myself would have. Which, and the narrative would go something like this, that the power of the clerics rests in the ability to chase away the spirits and to open up land. And I think in the 19th century, your first book and part of this talk, some of the importance there is opening up lands for peanut production. And this production of peanuts for international trade, which can enrich the community, and also, I think, offer opportunities for young people who don't want to be under the thumbs of their fathers, tied to a rice paddy somewhere, with restrictions on land use because there are spirits there and you can't possibly move there and farm. So this is opening up opportunities for young people. So I suppose my question is, can you address this sort of spiritualist orientation versus the materialist reality that what these clerics are doing is coming in and opening up land and giving opportunities for people for economic advancement?
Yes. No, thank you. Lots of great questions too. So I hope I do a good job responding to all of them. I will start with Dave's question about whether the clerics of Medina Cherno restricted their followers from participating in the more secular, practices around them or the institutions. No, if it's not employment with the government or becoming a magistrate or a judge in the secular courts, you're free to do what you want. Dancing is okay, music is okay. Those are not restricted by any means. The schools, I wonder if he was still alive, what his thoughts will be about the impact that the school have had on the Dara system, because it's very clear that significant transformation took place as a result of, because many of the Daras are more or less shutting down. So that's something that I wonder about. But what was the other question that you had about?
That kind of covers both.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, great. So your point really about references that some of these scholars who are returning from the Middle East talk about when they return, that they don't have a lot of sources that they can refer to while at home, or at least the people that they left behind did not have sources that they refer to or improve their piety or their faith or following the laws, Sharia. That's a very good point. But I think what is also happening is that there is a very different access to a different scholarly tradition that they are getting. That, as you know, in our region, the predominant school of thought is the Maliki school, and that there is a lot of books or literature that people can actually refer to. I went to the main library in Tuba, for example. I mean, it's massive with the kinds of books that people have. And you go to the Marabou's house, I mean, you see shelves and shelves and shelves of books, some of them handwritten, some of them purchased from distant places, but people have something. And those who go beyond the Dara, the first initial stages of their education to study law or history or stuff, they actually get quite a lot of this thing. I think that's there. But and certainly in the Gambia, I mean, if you look at what's happening outside of Medina Cherno, you might see evidence of these scholars, these returning scholars, actively critical of these clerical families or these Sufi traditions. So certainly there is an element of that. But my interest here was to look at places like Medina Cherno, and I can name a number of different villages like Kirmama, Saremama, where, I mean, that's also another Fula village where many of their young men have studied abroad, and then they return and they lived in this community. So I thought that's fascinating in its own, that you have these very well-educated people from Saudi Arabia. Right now, the Alkali, the head of the village, was educated in Saudi Arabia. And he came back a couple of decades ago, like maybe 3 decades ago, and then he settled right back into the tradition of farming and teaching the Dara. So I just thought that's somewhat unique, and you know, they haven't decided to go and settle in the city and look for a job. Instead, they went back to this small, isolated village. So I thought, why? So that's what I'm thinking about here. And you are right. I mean, if you look at Tuba and Tivaouane, I mean, yes, a lot of Talibans have been sent to different places. By the way, what is interesting about this, I remember when I was here, Professor Robinson, David Robinson, wanted me to study Medina Gunas so much, because the person who gave Cherno Muhammadu Said Ba the wird was from here. You know, and so you have a lot of students coming from Medina Gunas to study in this village too. So that connection. So I want to look at this as a study that focuses on these kinds of networks that connected many different Muslim communities across the region and beyond. You know, but focusing on a rural agrarian place where you did not have this expansion that you see in Tivaouane or Tuba or Kaolack. Yeah.
Because Medina Gunas, actually what I had in mind, Medina Gunas, which is right in the south, east of the Gambia.
Yeah.
Not very far from the geographical location of Medina Cherno.
Yes.
And then from the pictures and from what I've heard from you and then from even in Senegal, they very much look like in the practices and in how they do. So I thought maybe
even though they have differences, because these are full of Firdu, and these are Futa Jallow Fullers. You know, so very different in terms of ethno-linguistic orientation. But you're right. I mean, somehow the connection, and you know, I would argue that for Medina Cherno, I mean, it's far from Medina Guna simply because the roads are just like, I mean, you will have to go through the entire length of the country, which is so long, and that's why it was a pain for Senegal. Doesn't make any sense. I can't say this in the Gambia, but people are live streaming this maybe, so I will be in trouble. But it's here, so it's a couple of at least 500 kilometers from this village, which is just right here. So it's far. It's far, but it's so interesting to see how even they have some connections to Wallo, to Saloum, to Saint Louis, to Mauritania, and that's one of the puzzles that I really like to focus on here, because if you look at this small isolated village and wonder, how did Islam come to this place? What was going on? And you can't tell that story without paying attention to what was happening in the mid-19th century, certainly. But even afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so, yeah. The material.
I've heard enough.
Yeah, no, the point about, you know, the material calculations that people have, I think it's a legitimate one, and I have been really thinking about that a lot, particularly when you look at, you know, like the study of the Murid order with Donald Cruz O'Brien and his work on the Dara, the Quranic schools, and how the Murids have employed their followers in the fields to work. I was convinced of his analysis until Sheikh Babu published his book on fighting the greater jihad, and he gave a very you know, different interpretation of why this was going on, and having worked in the fields, and part of the reason why I ran away from the village was that I did not want to get tied to the farm, because that's not fun. So I understand how some there is some, I think, thinking that seem to connect these schemes with money and wealth. And if you look at some of the studies on these young Muslim students who are roaming about the streets of Dakar or Banjul begging, and street children basically who are exploited by their clerics for economic or whatever reasons they want to. I mean, that's part of it. But I think there is also this other aspect where I think the motivations are more spiritual rather than material, and that's what I want to. Why did he establish this big project, this orchard, and decided that he's not going to make profits out of that? Is it to mystify further the his motives by hiding it so that he can look to be offering opportunities to his followers, yet finding the money in some other ways? Perhaps, but overall, when you look at the kinds of investments he makes in his community, helping young men and women find husbands, build houses, taking his own money, paying for the education of some of these young people, even to faraway places like Saudi Arabia, using his car as the local ambulance for people in the village. I think there is just enough to say that maybe there is this other calculation that is entirely spiritual, and that's one thing that I really wanted to get at. Yeah.
I think we have just time for 2 more questions. If people can ask one question and not a long question, and then if we can have a shorter answer, we'll get more opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Assan, for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
We just touched on something the question was, like, you can talk maybe about a few minutes. When we are focusing on clerics, and I see a lot of parallelism between religion and the secular structures or religious structures. So I wonder, like, when we are focusing on these clerics, they were secular leaders, political leaders, or indigenous leadership on the ground, and how these clerics could compare to them, because focusing on Islam, which came later, and Africans were still having their structures and were doing things. So somebody might feel like, oh, it's because of Islam, this is what we have, all these changes or good things. Maybe that's not your issue now, but it's good sometimes to look around or within the Islamic system. There are some shortcomings. You see, for example, simulating our indigenous cultures, or people in the name of religion, trying to do what even can be done outside of religion, the pros and the cons of Islam in Africa, then and now in the school system, things like that. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah.
I think Abdullah has been.
Mine is a little bit suggestion or comment.
Okay, then we'll take these 2 if you can be quick.
Yeah,
You have a big fan club. We could talk for hours, but we don't have enough time for everyone. So let's take. Oh, sorry. Or did you have?
I was just going to say, I'm seeing a lot of folks leaving. So if you haven't signed the book, please do so before you leave. Okay. So in the study of Islam, recently we have seen the use of textual tradition, wherein people that study clerics like this person will try to read the actual Islamic texts they read that inform their thinking. I don't know whether you have in mind to do that, to kind of look at their texts and how that influence the way in which they react, what kind of project they establish. It's a whole lot of things coming from Islamic studies. It's very new in the study of Islam in the historical field, but I find it very interesting because it helps you sort of to upset the existing historiography in a way that you could have not done it through historical approach.
All right.
Eric, do you have a quick one?
Yes, I do. Thanks, thanks, Professor Sarr, and it's glad to have you here. So my question, I think I was very intrigued about the environmental component, and because I also, it makes me think about my project really broadly. Now, if I understood what you said, you mentioned that, or you discussed that the people moved to this sort of space. One, because they were attracted to the sort of lands to farm, to evade this sort of political influence, and also as a way of sort of gaining religious wealth, driving away the genes, and be able to attract following, if I'm correct. Now, in all of these, I see them as good factors to pull them, and if I were to think of these factors in the context of my research site in Zulezo, they also moved to live in the middle of water. One, for protection against the slave trade. Two, for religious purposes, because their river goddess asked them to do that. And three, to access resources in water, like fish and others. Now, in the case of my community, they shaped, or they have shaped their ecology, but ecology has also shaped them in return. Precisely, they are called in Zulezo. It means on water, the community on water. But in your case, it's called Madina Cherno, if I'm correct. I was wondering if the environment has shaped your people's thinking or identity in any way, as in relation to maybe in Zulezo, as the community obtains its name from the fact that they're living on water. And in your case, I am just dwelling on the name, Madina Cherno, which is more, if I were to say, Islamic inclined, making reference to Medina city, and then Cherno as a Marabu or something. So I'm wondering if you could comment about.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so, yes, no, that's okay, yeah. All right, well, thank you, Jonathan, for the very thoughtful question. Yes, indeed, I mean, if you look at this community and the history of this community itself, there are some friction, and, you know, I did not have the time to go into it in detail, but when he died in 1996, one of his younger brothers was alive, so he succeeded, but did not stay long, and he died too. Then you came to the children, and then there was dispute, succession dispute. Because what is interesting about him is that he had multiple wives, 4, and you have step-brothers and step-sisters, and you know, the politics in polygamous households sometimes can be very, very intense. So when he died, actually, that well, a few years after he died, that came to the fore. His younger brother, though, and this is one aspect of this community that really is worth telling. The incidence of monogamous marriages is surprisingly high in this place, even though some key individuals in this community have had 2 or 3 wives or 4, but his own younger brother had 1 wife his entire life, and there are many examples like that. So that didn't affect I think, his younger brother's own family, but it affected his own family itself. That's one. The other aspect of your question that I've considered in some of the sections of the project is the narrative about slavery, for instance, right? So, and then if you have a multicultural community, diverse groups of people, there are sometimes conflicts or tension. Things don't always work out the way you envision it. So indeed, yes, I want to talk about those things as well. So about the text, yes, there are documentary sources, and I will use them, and I have collected a lot. But this is the kind of really work that I want to do by looking at the continuation of this tariqa, this tradition, and what made it somewhat unique in this sense, that they are not allowing more people to come and acquire land and settle in the village. Controversial, right? But you come in as an outsider and you want to look for a house, a land to build a house on. They say, no, sorry, because two things. The land belongs to the families that have already settled, and two, the idea is that, well, we cannot give away somebody's land. You have to ask them. But our grandfather who founded this place does not want it to grow and become a city. So it's a conscious decision to remain rural and somewhat isolated. There are even stories of how the government wanted to do a paved road, and the man said, leave it as such. This is how I like it to be. So, I mean, this is a guy who received the highest honor from the first Gambian president in the 80s. He was given the National Order of, how is it called? MRG. The highest order for the kinds of things that he has done. But he did not even go to receive the award. He sent his son to go receive it. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a conscious decision that they have about maintaining a very small, isolated community rather than a big city, and so that's so far the focus that I want to emphasize. So about environment, briefly, that's the hardest because of the objective that I have in this study. So I'm not really, those are not the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. Maybe that's why I didn't really look for sources to that end. But yeah, it's fascinating. But I think here religion and to some degree ethnic identity as a Fuller who live a very unique kind of lifestyle, have a very unique lifestyle. I think all of those things might be intricately informed by the environment in which they live in, but it will require a lot more thinking before I can say anything useful. Yeah, but thank you. I mean, that's great. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering these wonderful questions.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for coming. I want to just let you know that next week in our Eye on Africa, we have something new. We have a showcase for student research. And we've got two students presenting. One of them is, are you still here, Idris? Abu Bakar will be presenting, and also Angela Manijichi. who's going to be talking about gender gaps in cropping systems, and Idris will be talking about rural migrant Muslim Hausa girls in northern Nigeria. I want to let everybody know that next week is Africa Week. It's the year of Global Africa. We have so many things going on. This weekend, there's a huge, wonderful forum on what's happening in Ethiopia. If you're not up to date on what's going on in the Horn of Africa, you need to be, so please come. It's being organized by Asefa Meretu. The students do the Taste of Africa. There's so much. There's a flyer there. In the dorms, there will be African food. There's an African cooking day called Taste of Africa. Super wonderful. And finally, Women's History Month, we're having a film series. The last film in the series is Iron Ladies of Liberia. That'll be March 26th at 7 p.m. And just a shout out to Liz Timms, the wonderful genius who's been putting all this together for us. What really terrific programs. So thank you, Liz. And thanks everyone for coming, and come out for Africa Week. We'd love to see you there.